Let's look at this and see what Jay Dyer thinks of Lutheranism. And of course, like with all my videos, I try to put it on 1.5 speed so we can get through it in a timely manner. And without further ado, here we go.
The difference between Orthodoxy and Lutheranism. Thank you. Keep up the good work. Well, I mean, Lutheranism is just kind of close to Anglicanism or Episcopalianism, except that Luther himself, unfortunately, was very immersed in dialectics too.
Unfortunately, and here's the first problem. We're right in 21 seconds in. First problem. Okay. Lutheranism is not like Anglicanism. Lutheranism is not like any branch that came out of the Reformation. And Luther does not equal Lutheranism. I know that sounds crazy for people to think because we're called Lutherans, so Luther must be our authority, right? No, actually, we don't believe everything Luther said. In fact, we didn't want to be called Lutheran at the beginning. We actually kind of despise the name. We're like a kid that was given a name to us that we didn't want. So that's the first issue, but we're going to get into that in just a second. Oh, look, my internet just pooped out on me. Look at that. All right, while it's loading, I'm going to check the chat. All right, showed up in your recommended. It was live. Figured it, checked it out.
Nominalists, influenced by a famous nominalist who was from the school of William of Ockham and Gabriel Bile.
My internet's going to crap out, guys. Oh, I hate that. I hate when I'm live and something crazy goes on. Just like when I mixed up Arius with Nestorius.
And this is how Luther was able to justify a lot of his very strange positions. So Luther eventually came to despise the Old Testament, and in this way, he's the father of higher criticism.
Gosh.
It's not by accident.
Okay, he's the father of higher criticism. Now, I'm going to pause that so it'll load a little bit so my internet's not completely trashed tonight. But here's the problem with any time anyone says that Luther was the father of higher criticism. They don't actually get where higher criticism came from. Higher criticism comes from the pietist-leaning side of Lutheranism. See, there was a split, even within Lutheranism, pretty early on, between the pietists and the confessional Lutherans. Pietists were basically every stereotype that papists and the East want to put on general Protestantism. They were Bible alone people. They were people who just wanted to go off into the woods, and it's just me and my Bible, and it's whatever interpretation that I wanted to come up with. And that's basically what pietism was. It was a sense of restoring some sort of piety within the church, because Lutherans were just too committed to this church history and tradition and dogmas and stuff like that. It just didn't work out for the pietists. That's where higher criticism comes from. It doesn't come from Luther exclusively. So that's a part of Lutheran history that a lot of people don't take into account when they're looking at where higher criticism come from, or even the fact that guys like, the first higher critics were in German state churches, which had embraced pietism at that point.
Accident that Wellhausen and Schleiermacher and the famous higher critics come from Luther. I mean, they come out of Tübingen. They come out of pietism. These Lutheran universities.
Not necessarily Luther.
Because Luther, in a very conscious fashion, set Moses against Christ. I mean, this is like a big part of his theology. I remember when I first started reading classical Reformed theology, Reformation theology, back when I was 18, 19, I had a little bit of a period where I considered Lutheranism. I read about 5 or 6 of Luther's commentaries on New Testament books, his commentary on Romans, Jude, Peter, Ephesians, Galatians and Ephesians. I read the other Lutheran works about the Jews, about bondage of the will. And what we get in these works is, again, a very strict dialectical tension between grace and law. Okay,
I'm going to pause it there. Okay, Jay, if you're watching, I doubt you are, because you don't have time to deal with some rando Lutheran on the internet. I get it. But here's the thing. None of those things are authoritative for Lutherans. Now, Luther's writings are cool and whatnot. He's right on a lot of stuff. But I couldn't care less as a Lutheran. You know what my authority is? Is this. If Luther doesn't agree with our confessional documents, then Luther's not Lutheran. I know that sounds weird, but, I really wish that the that the papists and the East would understand this about Lutherans is that what makes someone Lutheran is their adherence to the Lutheran confessions, the Book of Concord, not Luther. Luther did write some of the stuff in the Book of Concord, but in fact, he didn't write the majority of what's in the Book of Concord. And the Book of Concord disagrees with Luther on certain things. In fact, that's why we don't have the bondage of the will, despite the fact that Luther puts it in his top 3 of all the books that he wrote. We don't have the bondage of the will in our confessional documents. What makes someone a confessional Lutheran, what makes someone actually Lutheran, is their adherence to the Lutheran confessions, the Book of Concord, not Luther. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to friends and relatives who have either gone east or gone to Rome, and they don't understand this. They don't understand that Luther is not someone we look to as the highest authority within Lutheranism. It's just not. I know it can be confusing because of our name, but if you're going to respond to us, respond to what's in the Book of Concord, not what's in Luther.
Christ and Moses, between freedom and slavery in man. Man's nature is essentially bondage. And in the bondage of the will, he says that man is an ass that is either ridden by God or the devil.
Again, the bondage of the will is
history of the church,
not in our confessional
what
documents.
I was surprised to eventually find out was that most of these Reformation heresies, whether it's Lutheranism or Calvinism or Zwingliism or whoever, Melanchthon, it doesn't matter. These are...
Luther and Melanchthon are the only 2 Lutheran theologians he names. And then he lumps us all together with the other Protestants. Instead of ever going to our confessional documents to figure out what we say, and instead of going to other Lutheran theologians like Martin Chemnitz, Jacob Andrea, Johann Gerhard, Eugenius Hunius, we have a ton of theologians, guys. I know y'all don't care about that, but instead of lumping us in with all the other Protestants, probably need to read up if you really want to challenge Lutheranism. I'm giving you guys pro-gamer tips right now. If you really want to challenge Lutheranism.
Regurgitations, whether they know it or not, of ancient heresies. And the most striking way to really refute whether it's Lutheranism or Calvinism or classical Protestantism is, number one, to talk about the Trinitarian implications of the theology
we don't like
of
Calvinists, by the way.
Redemption or the penal death of Christ in their view. So the penal sanctions of the fall in that view are that we were due eternal death. And so the only way to be saved was that Christ would have to take that debt that we incurred upon himself.
Do I need to read Gregory Palamas again? I mean, I will if I got to. I mean, I could just read the first part of the quote I have here. A sacrifice was needed to reconcile the Father on high with us and to sanctify us since we had been soiled by fellowship with the evil one. That's Gregory Palamas. And if you don't believe that I'm putting him in context, go read it for yourself. Homily 16. It's freely available.
That, of course, is the sufferings and torments of hell. That's the payment that was due, right? The problem with this is that when you adopt the traditional Calvinist, Reformation, Westminster Confession...
Lutherans aren't Calvinists. I don't know why Calvinism comes
John
up.
Owen, Spurgeon...
We don't like
Charles
Calvin.
Hodge, all the post-Lutheran Lutherans, but Luther was very into this idea that Jesus was damned by the Father. In fact, Ryan Dawson brought that up to me as an argument against Christianity. And I said, you know what? Only Orthodox Christianity consistently has argued against this idea. And the origins of this idea, of course, go back to Anselm and Anselm's theories of the atonement.
Yeah, that's not... It goes back to Anselm, even though Palamas said it and Cyril said it, and a whole bunch of other... St. John Chrysostom talked about the substitution of the Son for our sin. I mean, for goodness sake, he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. That's apostolic teaching. That's not Anselm.
Which are, of course, the results of divine simplicity and Augustinian presuppositions. There's no question about it. I've read all these things. I've read all the Anselmian works. I've read all this stuff. So I'm not just talking out of my butt. So let's go back to bondage of the will. In bondage of the will, Luther says there is no free will in man. You're either ridden by God or the devil. So this is kind of the equivalent, a little more extreme equivalent version, actually, of total depravity. Calvin at least still has verbal homage to free will, even if it's a strict predestinarian system. But in Lutheranism and in the Lutheran confessions too, Heidelberg and so forth, it's not like this is just...
Whoa, stop. I got to back that up. I paused it too quick. I want y'all to hear this. listen to what he says this is how you know that Jay Dyer has never read the Lutheran Confessions. And if he has, it was skimming through them or something, because he's mixing up. So, listen to this.
Even if it's a strict predestinarian system. But in Lutheranism and in the Lutheran Confessions too, Heidelberg and so forth, it's not like this.
Heidelberg? Really? Look, I messed up on, I mixed up Arius with Nestorius on the last stream. I get things happen, right? Arius, Nestorius, makes sense. They both end in us, right? Makes sense you would make that mess up. I ain't perfect. But where? Somebody show me where the Heidelberg Catechism is in the Book of Concord. It's a Calvinist catechism. It's a Calvinist confession of faith. It's not in the Book of Concord. The Heidelberg is a Lutheran confession? Color me shocked.
This is just in Luther. The idea is that the only way that man can be saved because he's so fallen is because he needs irresistible grace, or he needs some kind of efficacious.
Lutherans don't believe in irresistible grace because we don't confess the Heidelberg Catechism. I don't know how to respond to something that stupid.
This movement of grace, because man is inherently fallen to the point of always being in opposition to God. This is dialectics. The best way to refute this is to read St. Maximus' dispute with Pyrrhus.
The best way to refute this is to read the Book of Concord, because we don't confess that. We don't confess the Heidelberg Catechism on this topic. We just don't. I don't know what other way to put this.
And guess what? Then you realize that monothelitism and monergism or monergism, miaphysitism, this has already been dealt with. The church has already dealt with the heresy that man loses his will or has lost his will in the fall, and that the grace of God has to overcome it. No, man always retains his natural energy. Now, he requires grace, which is supernatural, which lifts him up and deifies him, sure. But even fallen man retains the image of God. In the Orthodox conception, he's lost the likeness of God, but he's not lost the image of God. So the idea that fallen people only sin all the time, that's heresy. It's the Manichaean heresy, and it's also the heresy of monothelitism. Because
guess what? We don't confess that. You probably would know that if you read the Book of Concord. Calvinists tend to talk about total depravity, whereas Lutherans tend to talk about total corruption. Go read the Apology of the Augsburg Confession and our doctrine of sin in order to figure that one out.
Because there's always synergy. The synergy, the human energy that operates, it's not enough to save man, right? So we're not saying salvation by works, but there's always cooperation because man never loses his natural energy. How do we know that? We know that because of the centuries of theology, of Christology. The Christology that the councils dealt with solve the problems of soteriology. This is why the church historically didn't begin with Romans and justification and soteriology when it tried to explicate how it is we are made right with God. It begins with Christology and the Trinity.
In fact, Jay's kind of right on this in the sense that, if your soteriology is messed up, your Christology is going to be messed up. In fact, a book I would recommend to Jay and anyone who is listening is Martin Chemnitz's book on the two natures of Christ. That would be a great one to deal with some of the stuff he's about to spew out towards us.
This is what the church worked out historically, because you can't get your soteriology right if your Christology is wrong. This is why Arianism was such a big deal in the early church, because it ultimately affects soteriology. But Protestantism and evangelicalism begin with soteriology.
Really quick, I want to recommend this. I was supposed to recommend this at the beginning of the stream, but there is a great paper dealing with the influences of Eastern Orthodoxy in evangelicalism. It's called The Influence of Theosis and Eastern Theology on Early Evangelicalism by Kevin Schuler. Pretty good paper. It's a pretty good paper, pretty good. And this goes to the heart of my problem with Eastern Orthodoxy and why they constantly move the goalpost when you're talking to them, is that they end up becoming to the side of the same coin that they're fighting against. It ends up becoming, this is something that the East tends to look a lot like evangelicalism because they have the same mystical theology as evangelicalism, and that's something that paper goes into. So I would recommend reading that.
So in other words, they have the wrong ordo theology, have the wrong order of theology. You can't do your soteriology and do your Christology and your Tridology as an afterthought. It will end you up in heresy. So the easiest way to refute Protestantism, Calvinism, Lutheranism, classically speaking, is to point out that to say that Jesus was damned by the Father requires Jesus to be two people. It requires a human Jesus who could be damned and a divine Jesus who's the Son of God.
There's a problem with that, dude. Lutherans confess all of the early ecumenical councils. Well, except 7, because the West generally doesn't like 7. So, yeah, we have the early church councils. We have the ecumenical councils. We don't confess the things you're telling us we confess. You'd probably know this if you read the Book of Concord, or if you read something, a theologian other than Luther, like, I don't know, Martin Chemnitz on the two natures in Christ. I mean, come on, Jay, you're smarter than this, man.
That's called Nestorianism. Nestorianism is the ancient heresy of Nestorius that there are two persons in Christ who kind of mingle together, and at times we see one kind of
we don't confess heresy.
The other poking through when he's eating. That's the human
Nestorianism.
person, Jesus of Nazareth. When he's walking
we
on
call
water,
Mary the
that's the Son of God,
Theotokos.
only
Confessional
God can do that,
Lutherans.
Right? Well, if you read the entire debate between Cyril and Nestorius, what you come to learn is that this has already been dealt with. And it was, in fact, a Nestorian argument that when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" that Jesus was being cut off from the Father. The only way to have Jesus cut off from the Father is to say that he's a human person. That's literally what Nestorius said.
That's why we don't confess Nestorianism. We don't. And if you would have read actual Lutheran theological books, if you would have read our confessions, you would know that. We don't confess Nestorianism. And you'd know this if you took the time to actually study what Lutheranism is.
No. So what did Ephesus decide, and what became the norm for Orthodoxy? Ephesus said with Cyril, if you read St. Cyril's on the unity of Christ against Nestorius, and if you read, and by the way, I've read Nestorius' writings too, and I've read John McGuckin's book on St. Cyril and the Christological controversy, which is really good.
He's read so many books. But he just can't seem to get around to that Book of Concord.
St. Cyril said there's only one person there, and that's the Son of God. There's no human person in Christ whatsoever at all. There's a human nature, a fully human nature. There is no human hypostasis in Christ at all. And so it became the norm for St. Cyril and for those of the Council of Ephesus to say that the sole subject in all the actions of Christ, within time and space, into the resurrection and eternity, the only subject there for all of them is the divine person of the Logos. The only one. That's it. No two Jesuses. Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God.
I wish he would get around to, refuting Lutheranism. I would really, really wish that, he started this video saying, what's the problem with Lutheranism? He goes off on tangents about Calvinism. He thinks that we confess the Heidelberg Catechism because he's never read our confessional documents. I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for him to deal with what Lutherans actually believe.
There is no human person in Christ at all, whatsoever, period. Boom. Once you grasp that, you will be on your way to orthodoxy, because you will.
No, you'll be on your way to stupidity, because you're arguing against a literal straw man who does not exist. Lutherans don't talk like this. Lutherans don't confess like this. Again, you would know if you read our confessional documents or you read a theologian outside of Luther. And I'm pretty sure that your reading of Luther is all over the place. You're basing your assessment on Luther on what you say, 7 books that you read about Luther or that Luther wrote, and you're coming out with this Christology that Luther himself would not agree with. I mean, for goodness sake, Luther called Mary the Queen of Heaven. Luther believed in so many things that you're saying he doesn't believe in. That I don't understand how to go with this. For someone who reads a ton of books, he just doesn't seem to have much knowledge.